and welcome to the latest instalment of our Centre's Book Drop series. So my name is Wendy Conway-Lamb. I'm a PhD student here at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. And we're really pleased at the Centre to have visiting us at the moment Hayley Stevenson.
It's a pleasure to be back. It's been years since I've been back. So
Yeah, great to see you here. Thanks for coming. So Hayley is an Associate Professor, now based in Argentina. She's at the Universidad Torquato di Tella.
Yes.
Yeah, and we invited her to join our book drop series today because you have a new book out.
I do. This
Here
year,
it is.
my book, textbook, Global Environmental Politics, Problems, Policy and Practice, came out with Cambridge.
Looking satisfyingly new and shiny here.
Actually, I did like that cover. Most environmental politics books have very grim, depressing covers, and actually pollution can be quite pretty. Who would have thought?
Is that from actual pollution?
It's water pollution. Yeah, that's water pollution.
Well,
Yeah.
it makes for a beautiful cover. So tell us, this obviously, Global Environmental Politics, Hayley, it's a textbook. So can you tell us, it's aimed at mainly students, or who when you were writing it, who were you thinking of as your readership?
I was thinking of, so I moved to the University of Sheffield in 2012, and I started to design this course on global environmental politics, and at that point I had a group of master's students, and I'd never studied global environmental politics, and so I found myself in this position of how would I design a course and not having that kind of background of thinking about how I'd been taught it. And I wanted a book that explained the issues, various issues, as well as kind of various political responses. I'd studied climate change in my PhD, and so I knew a huge amount about climate change, but I was also really aware that climate change and any other issue doesn't make much sense on its own. Like, they're all part of this crisis of unsustainability, and if you just understand kind of one part of it, it doesn't give a full kind of picture about the situation that we have ourselves in. So when I started looking, I couldn't find the book that I wanted to teach, and so what do? You write the book that you want
yourself. Yeah.
So I wanted this book that explains many different issues. So I have different case studies in the book where I team up like water and conflict and sustainable development and diplomacy, climate change and these voluntary transnational action, resistance, social movements, resistance and food production, so that I could kind of explain to students how the various different ways in which the international community, broadly understood, responds to different issues. And I think I would hope that it is actually relevant beyond students, especially now that people beyond environmental politics are having to incorporate the environment into their courses, or at least have a better understanding about different issues. And so if people can kind of pull it off the shelf and see what is kind of toxic waste about, or what's deforestation, and what does it mean as a political issue rather than necessarily from a natural science perspective, to get a good understanding from a politics perspective, was what I really wanted to do with the book.
Great. I think it will appeal to people from any different disciplinary backgrounds. And so let's talk about the title. It's Global Environmental Politics, and then the subtitle is Problems, Policy and Practice. And you actually say in the introduction, Hayley, that you see these are often quite actually unaligned. Can you tell us a bit more about what you mean?
Yeah, so in the book I really wanted to be able to kind of show what the problems are, then what we try to do to kind of respond to them, but then actually what we do. And often they're quite different. Like, you can imagine if you can define or recognize an issue and then come up with a good plan of action and then implement that, well, that sounds great, but that's actually not how the real world works. So that's political issues don't tend to work that way. So we see that problems are often recognized as problems long after they're already kind of causing environmental and social harm. Then especially when governments and also the private sector, when they kind of craft these policies or agreements or plans of action to respond to these problems, usually their plans are under ambitious, they're quite weak, and then when they're implemented, they're often delayed in their implementation, or they're incomplete in their implementation. And so you would see this kind of we'd see that the kind of problems, the policies, and then the actual practice or action are just not aligned in a way that can best respond to these kind of problems. So I think climate change is the classic example, right? Like by the time we've known for a long time, even since the early 20th century, the late 19th century, there was already some signs that this was a problem, and then we have governments still trying to come up with decent policy. Perhaps to give a less familiar example, which would be toxic waste, and or mercury exposure to mercury. It was already in the 1950s and 60s when we recognized the human and the environmental problems of exposure to mercury. And only last year, the Minamata Convention came into effect. So that's decades. Like what's happening in decades to what's kind of causing those delays, and that's why I try to give a sense of that. And I think it's the Minamata Convention. It's great that we finally have this convention, but if we look at kind of toxic waste more broadly, we can see the chapter on toxic waste is called problem displacement, and sadly one of the kind of responses to pollution or environmental problems is just to kind of push them away onto other people. And so there is a long history of states kind of shipping away their toxic waste to developing countries, exporting it, sometimes with the permission of the importing country. There's also a lot of illegal shipments. And one of the problems there with the waste is that we have multiple agreements on toxic waste, on chemicals, and kind of that kind of fragmentation of governance is a strong characteristic of global environmental governance these days. And when you might think, well, the more agreements the better, but in this case I think it's not so true, because different agreements create kind of ambiguity and overlapping or gaps in regulation, and that kind of allows states to take advantage of that kind of uncertainty or that kind of ambiguity, and find ways of putting the responsibility onto somebody else.
Fantastic. Well, a really great range of case studies to illustrate this, and congratulations on publishing it. It must have been a lot of work. As you were writing it, did you have a kind of a special bit or a favourite section that
I think to be honest, the book itself is quite special to me. This is my fourth book, and it's the one I most enjoyed writing. I think writing a textbook is kind of a little small bit of resistance in academia. Everybody tells you don't write a textbook, and nobody gets promoted off a textbook. Nobody kind of gets a grant off a textbook. It's one of those things that is seen as not very everyone likes to have a good textbook to use to prepare for their class or to recommend to their students, but to write a textbook is not seen as a good career move. But to be honest, I so much enjoyed working on it, and the idea that kind of a textbook is similar to a research monograph kind of found to be very kind of nonsense, actually, because each of those, especially the case study chapters, where each one is a little research project itself. And so I learnt such a huge amount from preparing the book. I mentioned when we started the conversation that I hadn't studied this topic, and it was when I started, I was enrolled in my PhD program to study something completely different on post-conflict peace building. And I went along in the first week of my PhD. I went along to this seminar of Friends of the Earth, and they were talking about climate refugees. And I thought, oh my God, this is really this issue of climate change. It kind of brings together politics and justice and all these important topics. And so I changed. I was lucky that my supervisors kind of let me change topic at the beginning of the PhD for something I knew nothing about. So the opportunity to kind of go back and be a student again to write the book was a lot of fun.
Great. Oh well, your passion and your enjoyment of writing it, I think, comes through to the reader. So thanks so much for talking to us about it. And I hope if anyone's watching and hasn't got your hands on the book yet, then I hope this may have whetted your appetite. You can so people can find it on the Cambridge University Press website.
Amazon, all good bookstores.
So do look it up, recommend it to your colleagues, and maybe ask your library to stock it. So great talking to you.
Great, thanks a lot, Wendy.
Thank you.